Okay, I think we are live now. Hope my audio is clear and yeah. Okay, with that note, hello everyone. Very good evening. I'm Sunil Kumar Das, welcoming you all to the new episode of the Sunil Show. On this podcast, we dive into IT and project management, discussing from project management, product development, business analysis, and to the latest trending technologies we cover it all. Subscribe us on YouTube and join us on the Sunil Show for valuable knowledge and inspiration, which will help you to propel your career forward. Today, I'm much excited to welcome our guest, Megan, to the show. Megan, it's great pleasure to have you here. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's really good to be here. I'm excited for all the things we have to talk about today.
That's good. So, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. Hope everyone joining us live is having a good evening, morning, wherever you are.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah. So, Megan, before we dive into our technical discussion, so could you share with our audience a bit about your background, your journey, your expertise in the IT and project management?
Sure. So, I've been in project management for about 8 years. I I would say my love for it started back in high school. I was a stage manager for theater productions, and I really kind of fell in love with that experience. And just kind of getting to know that part of me led to look into. I thought maybe I was going to head toward an event planning career for a while. So I kind of looked at that, and that didn't pan out. But I ended up getting hired in a project management role at a nonprofit. And when I started, I didn't really know what that meant. They also didn't really kind of have an industry like standard definition of project management, but we kind of figured it out together over the past 8 years. Like I've grown and developed as a project manager, and together we've leveled up practices, and it's been a really fun journey to kind of use those skills and those parts of me that I discovered back in high school, kind of like the idea of getting a team together and like pulling all of these pieces and moving parts to create this really cool result at the end that for a theater production or even an event, like just makes all your guests really happy. And I found project management really cool because it's all the skills and the tools that it takes to produce any cool result, right? Like so it could be an event that you're producing, but you can produce almost anything. And it's really cool to be a part of that and to be in a career field that I get to help create some really cool results and fill some really cool needs. So
That's a brilliant introduction. Thanks for that. So, today we will be discussing about general project management, a few definitions. We'll touch base communication, we'll touch base deadlines, project schedule, and status updates, project status, and we'll discuss something about Reishi chat and how do we use in our project effectively. And you as a entry level project manager, how can you effectively manage agile projects? So we'll touch base all these topics, but to start with, you know Megan, I would like to understand you as a project manager, how much of your time you invest on communication.
I mean, my knee jerk reaction is to say all of it. Almost anything in a project feels like communication in some way. So, like at the very beginning of a project, whatever the idea is of what you're trying to accomplish, it's this art of getting everybody to understand that vision, right? Whether that's through meetings or written communications or any number of means, and then once you define and break down the work, you need to make sure everyone understands their portion of that work. And then, really, as things progress, you're communicating back and forth about status, and then things have to shift to keep meeting project goals. That's communication. So, yes, there's moments when I'm working by myself to like go in and check on like chart out a schedule or technical things occasionally, but so much time is spent in email, it's spent on meetings. Even when I'm in project management software, I'm like communicating with people in that space. So very little, I think, is not communication or part communication.
Right. So the answer is all the time. You know. However, so if you would like to set or emphasize on how important it is to communicate effectively, so how do you do that? How do you set the benchmark with the audience, that how important it is to communicate effectively with your team, your project schedule, your project sponsor, your customer, how important it is?
I mean, the short answer is very important, and that's the core of the job. Not that they're, no project manager communicates perfectly, so there's always opportunity to assess and correct. But that is the essential task you're doing, like moving small bits and large bits of information from one person to the next, one stakeholder, one team to the next. So there there isn't really project management without communication. There's maybe isolated elements of, if you are the project scheduler, if that's your role, you can sit down and work on that on your own, but you're really not going to get very far or achieve anything, because a project, like, one of the essential elements of a project as we would understand it in project management, is you're working with a team, right? So you can call something a project that you do as an individual, but the discipline of project management is getting a team to accomplish things. So unless that team is communicating, you're really not going to get anywhere on purpose, anywhere that you're trying to go intentionally.
So as you mentioned, that's great. So as you mentioned, there is a space. You understand the space and tailor your communication. So how do you tailor your communication style to different stakeholders or different team members? Because end of the day, you need to work with people. you know
Hmm.
so some are internal, some are external. So the way you communicate with your team members, those who are working on the project, or eventually they are the pillars of your project success, and eventually your stakeholders, so how do you tailor your communication styles?
Hmm. Sure, I'll answer that in a couple different ways. I think the key, like, as much as possible, you're building a relationship with each person and letting that relationship inform your communication style, especially when you are communicating one-on-one with people. So if it's somebody that works at my company that I have a relationship with, I probably know their preferred communication style or communication channel, email, meeting, phone, whatever, and I can use those things to make sure I get what I need from them and get them what they need. So one-on-one with someone I know, it's going to be very relationship informed. Um, if I'm communicating to a group, that's, I might be thinking more about what best serves the project. So especially, for example, at the beginning of a project, I know not everybody is a huge fan of meetings. I'm a pretty big fan of meetings, especially at the beginning of a project, because I believe, like, at least having some kind of kickoff meeting to have everybody who has a small part in the project understand the whole context of the project. So when I think there's a risk for a lack of clarity or a lack of understanding, I'm going to err on the side of either an in-person or a video meeting where we can see each other's faces. So that's another way that I will think about um, tailoring. Those are probably my top two things that I'll keep in mind.
That's very true. So sorry for that. So when you going for a communication, if you need to understand whether it's a one-on-one or one-to-many, so
Mhm.
that's how you will be able to mold your communication style, and you will set the tone with the people. On
Mhm.
that note, understanding about the communication, we have different stories to tell. First, we some meetings we are going ahead with setting up the tone, setting, passing the objective, project objectives.
Right. Hmm.
Second, we make for bring some surprises, or to share some surprise at the last moment with the stakeholders about the project schedule, or a delay, or success, or the failure. So
Hmm.
we have varieties of news. Now, on that note, how would you communicate effectively with any your stakeholders, any surprises or any project delay? So what sort of things you
Hmm.
need to take care, or what data you present?
Sure. Um, well, I think I'll say, on your project, the better you can set expectations and establish good relationships with your stakeholders before the problems happen, the smoother things will go when you have a problem. And especially if you're like, yeah, we're expecting some bumps here and here. Here are some of our unknowns. Here are some of our risks. Like when risks turn into issues, it's going to be much easier to have that conversation. Um, if there is time, it's great to talk to other. When an issue arises, like gather enough information about that issue that you can go to that stakeholder with some options, with some solutions, if they're the decision maker, or maybe they're not, but you'll let them know, like, here's, we might be going one of these directions. But at the end of the day, if you can't come up with solutions right away, it's still better to be honest than not. So you don't need to be overly detailed. You don't need to get into 1,000 weeds, but they do need to know the essentials of what's going on. And so um, everything else being equal, it's important to not wait too long. And if they feel you're being honest and transparent, that's more likely to build trust as well.
That's great one, actually. So you need to be very honest. If you don't know the answer currently, you need to be honest and upfront, say no, and you borrow some time and get back to them whenever you have the answers ready. So that's great one. So now, as you work with your team, creating a project schedule or during the project execution, you as a project manager, you must work on building an empowered team or self-organized team with that mindset, and you know, to ensure you are meeting the deadline. There are two aspects here. One, you are creating a kind of creative and self empowered team,
Mhm.
where also you need to meet the deadline. So how do you balance these two things, a creative team one side and you are meeting the deadline one side? So how do you balance the equation between?
Right. So, again, I mean, knowing your team as much as possible and good relationships are really helpful when it comes to deadlines. But deadlines especially require a lot of communication. So here's whether you have kind of whatever each team member style is. I would when I'm planning a project, whenever possible, I like to get input from the people doing the work on what the deadline should be. I think that makes them feel empowered and trusted. Like whenever the project allows that, occasionally it won't, but when it does, I want to say, how long do you need to do a good job on this, so that later, if I come back and try to enforce a deadline, like it's easier for them to live up to a deadline that they picked. But even if I can't let them pick the deadline, I communicate as much as possible, not just what the deadline is, but why it matters. Like I'll start with the why it matters before I even talk about the when. What does this mean for the project? What does this mean for the company? What does this mean for our users or our customers? And it's true that when people get involved in when they're deep in the creative process, it sometimes is harder for them to focus on deadlines. But I know a lot of those same people really care that the thing that they're making eventually has an impact on somebody, an impact that it needs to have. And so if I can um, give them that space to make their thing, but then take it on myself to remind them, hey, like, meeting this deadline is going to achieve this. It's going to allow your work to get out into the world. It's going to allow your work to accomplish this. And taking it out myself to remind them, but in those really positive, empowering ways, it kind of keeps up the team spirit and the team morale while helping them remember deadlines that they might not be naturally as inclined to focus on.
So that's very true. So when people are working on something very creative, eventually they miss the deadline because that's how the job is. However, you as a project manager, you must ensure people are meeting the deadline. Now, on the similar note, we always find techniques or use techniques or approaches to get something done. And you as a project manager, you have to motivate your team to meet the deadline. So on
Mhm.
that note, how do you motivate your team?
Sure.
What sort of approaches you have?
Sort of a
Approaches or
approaches. Yes, yes. Um, sure. So, I mean, focusing on the why, I think, is a huge part of motivation. But I mean, another important factor is, especially in in a waterfall project or one with some waterfall components, you're going to have um, you're going to have other people who are waiting on them to get the thing done so they can do their next piece, right? So to whatever extent, um, thinking about the end goal, if that doesn't get them all the way to keeping on track to the deadline, like they have some accountability to their team members. They have someone else who needs to do their job. And so, you know, kindly with a smile, reminding them of this other person also who needs something from them. Um, that's another major technique I'll use. I don't very often, um, you know, hound people about the deadline specifically. I don't very often elevate something to a manager unless it's a last resort. But it's just I try to come in positively and with a smile, and remind people of like these are the impacts of staying on track that we're all kind of aiming for. So
That's great. Always, just think of the bigger picture. So that
mhm,
even when you set the tone, you always showcase them the bigger picture. This is what this is where we have to be, and this is what the impact we create.
mhm.
And for that, these are the kind of activities we must go on, and every activity has to have the deadline associated with it. So that's very true. When you go with a smile and no need to show hearts with them, but yeah, always you keep some checkpoints which will help you to understand the progress as well as them realizing the need to complete anything on everything on time. That's great. So again, when we think of communication, there is one important point is feedback. When we communicate with people, we share feedback and also we receive feedback. you know so what's your thought on giving feedback and how it should be to make real impact on your team?
That's a great question. I'll be honest that this is probably not a tool I use very often, and it's probably a growth area for me. Um,
Mhm.
I I've been involved in a couple of projects that have retrospective meetings in them, so that's a little more natural of a place for that. Um, but I think I've been in a couple of conversations where I've tried to describe, this is the outcome that I was trying to get to and it didn't work, and like let's collaboratively figure out how we're going to, next time that could be better. Um I think there's probably some room for more direct feedback though. I think that has a time and a place, and I think that's probably an area for me to work on.
That's great. When we talk about the feedback, this one important thing is it's always share the observations and do not start with a negative point which people will take in a negative way.
Mhm.
So from that perspective, could you outline some techniques or some guidelines that will help the entry level project managers out there to take care of the things during the any one-on-one meeting or feedback session?
Sure. So, I have hosted feedback sessions for projects, kind of at the end, and so that's probably more an area I can speak to. And I've been in a number of, like, often we'll call them debrief meetings, and I think the most important thing for those meetings is to have go in and have a structure to them, because I
Mhm.
think when those meetings don't have a structure, I mean, you have good intentions, you wanted to gather feedback, you wanted to get better, but with no structure, it's very easy for it to go one of two ways. Either everybody just complains about what went wrong, in a way that isn't helpful, that isn't constructive, or you'll end up in a group think type situation where people only feel safe expressing positive things, and then your team or your people aren't going to grow as much. So a structure I've used for a debrief conversation specific to a project that I've just started to use it, but I find it really helpful, is to have, if possible, like a whiteboard or a virtual whiteboard where you have kind of three categories of things displayed. And one of those are thinking of like the next time we would do this type of project. What are the things we would repeat? What would we do again? We did this well, we'd repeat it. That's a category. then what would we stop doing? What would we not repeat? That's another category. And then what would we start doing next time? What would we didn't try it this time, but maybe we should have next time we want to try those. And if you have those three specific categories and it makes clear you're inviting all of those types of feedback, you don't get stuck in that like only the conversations about the positives. But when you get the negatives or the changes, they're more specific, they're more directed toward making positive changes next time. So I think that's a really simple structure that I really like using for a meeting at the end of a project to gather feedback and get better.
That's great. That's very spot on. So moving ahead with the other topic is status updates. So
Mhm.
eventually we in a project, we as a project manager, we have to take status from the team members, and we have to keep our sponsors, the stakeholders, updated. So
Mhm.
the two-way communication, you as a project manager, you do. So you take the feedback, the statuses from your team, and
Mhm.
you update to the stakeholders.
Mhm. Mhm.
However, on that note, uh, what is the best way to set the expectation with your team to have the timely updates?
Mhm. Sure. Um, Again, tailoring is very important in a project, and in every project with every team, I'd make some specific decisions how it's going to work in that situation. Again, I would lean on team relationships, and I like how you said setting expectations. Again, talking about it at the beginning makes it easier as you go on in the course of the project. Um, but whatever when given the opportunity with a team, I'm going to try to use a way of sharing information that team is familiar with and comfortable with. So there are a lot of benefits to a project management software, but not every team is familiar with them. And often, if you're with a team or a company that's not using one and you're going to start, it's a long transition process and a lot of helping people on an individual basis to get better. So on one project and one team, not everybody is going to be ready to jump into a project management software or have access to that. Or occasionally, I've done projects with partner organizations that are on a different project management software. We tried to keep it updated in both. It got extensive. Um, so all that to say, you're going to get the best results on the project at hand if the way you're communicating about project information or whatever you're relying on as your source of truth for a project is a concept you'll hear sometimes is something that all the team members are used to. So yes, there's a lot of disadvantages to managing a project just by email, but there might be a situation I would say yes, but everyone's going to communicate this way. Um, so regardless, whatever communication system you're going to use, you're going to want to communicate what that is. But if you're going to prioritize the goals of this one project as opposed to like we're growing as a company in this direction, like really check in and see where your team is comfortable communicating. Um, it could be meetings. Meetings work too, but use something that they're comfortable using, and you'll get better updates and better communication.
That's great. So always understanding, their perspective and their flexibility is important, and eventually, your organization will have set up things ready for you. Let's say some things, based upon that constraints. Also, you need to make your plan. You know. So on that similar note, what are uh, the set of project management softwares or tools you would recommend to learn to our audience, those who are willing to transition into project management as a career?
Mhm. Um, I think so. I've worked heavily in two systems. I've dabbled in a few others, and I think if you know one robust project management software really well, I think you'll transition pretty heavily to others. So if you take the time to get to know a system that tracks tasks, that does Gantt charts, that has various dashboard and reporting mechanisms that pull on that data that's stored in the projects. Um, I think you'll transition pretty easily, whatever kind of software your company you want to go into is using. I don't think one is, stand out better than another. There are lighter weight versions, there are more robust versions, but a lot of the core functionality in the robust ones is pretty similar.
That's true. That's true. So also for the communication, perspective, which of the best tool that you have encountered as of now, and you would recommend project managers to use the same?
For communication, is it lame if I say meetings? um, it, um, yeah, I mean, it's really a combination of everything. So, I mean,
Right, right.
keeping, keeping
We
your
may use Jira at the same time. We can go for Slack as a official communication updates. The collaborative team. That's
hmm
great. So
yep.
let's move to something different, which is one of the kind of effective tool to assign roles and responsibilities
hmm
is the RACI matrix.
hmm hmm
So how do you recommend uh, using the RACI
hmm
at the beginning of your project to make the assignments very clear, roles and
hmm
responsibilities?
hmm Sure. So let me back up for, if this isn't something you've used before. So RACI is an acronym, RACI, and each of those letters stands for a role that somebody might have on a project or something that the project needs from them. So R stands for responsible. This is somebody who's responsible, usually to do something. So if you think of a task, this would be like the person assigned to the task is responsible for it. Um, the A stands for accountable. And so if somebody's accountable for something, they might not be the person doing it, but it's up to them to make sure it gets done. So an easy way to think of this is our person who's responsible for a task, their boss might be accountable that that task gets done, even though they're not doing it. A project sponsor often is accountable for a lot of things on a project without being responsible, without actually doing them, right? And then the C stands for consult. So these would be people that you are consulting for input or advice on something, but they're not the one doing it. They're not responsible. They're not even accountable. You want to hear what they think and they can move on. You can move on. And then the I stands for inform. These are people that need to know what's happening on the project, but they don't have any influence over what's happening. It might influence them in something they need to do or are concerned about down the road. So they're just informed. So those are the basic concepts. Um, and then to the reason that the concept is like a matrix, this is a table or a spreadsheet. So this kind of tool, and you would create one by um, on one axis of it, you're going to list all of the people whose roles you're trying to define. It doesn't really matter which axis. It could be your high level stakeholders, it could be your team members, it could be all of them, it could be you could list groups of people if that's the level that makes sense on your project. And then the other axis is going to be it could be a number of different things, the way you break down parts of your project. It could be tasks, it could be deliverables, it could be even decisions, major project decisions you might make one of these for. I gave a high level overview. I think you asked a more specific question about it. Would you remind me, Sunil?
Yes. So how important it is?
How important it is. Um, I think that here's kind of the main thing I have to say about a RACI chart. And here's my secret. I don't know if I've ever actually made one on a real project. Um, I think that I think they're really important to probably write out if you're dealing with a project with a lot of people you haven't worked with before, whether that's a lot of we're working with the public, whether you're working with projects across companies. I don't think I use them as much because I regularly work with people I know well within my company. So it's a little less critical to write it down, but knowing these four categories and these types of roles has really influenced how I think about my projects and how I communicate on my projects. So um, I know that, you know, whenever I'm talking to somebody, I know in the back of my mind which of these four roles they have on that item, and that influences how I talk about it to them. Even if I'm not saying you're accountable, you're responsible, I'm saying, hey, we need you to do this thing to someone who's responsible. I'm saying, hey, we need your advice, your thoughts on this to someone who consults. If somebody is informing, if we're just informing them, I'm saying, hey, we just want to let you know that this is coming, that type of language to set them up to understand their role, even if I'm not explaining this whole racy thing that's going on in the back of my mind.
That's great. That's great. So while we are creating RASI matrix, such an important matrix for our project, now there are some common mistakes people they can commit. So
Mm-hmm.
what are the different common mistakes that you can outline? Okay, these are the common mistakes that you need to avoid while creating a RASI matrix.
Mm-hmm.
If so, so what are those?
Sure. I think the most impactful mistake that I would try to avoid is don't show your racy matrix to somebody before you've had a discussion with them, before they understand what their role is, because there's a lot of opportunity for somebody's feelings to get hurt or for them to get upset if they have a role on your chart that is different from what they expected to have. So it's very helpful if someone's roles are presented to them in a different format first. And then the RACI chart is, then once they're able to see it, that's just kind of the record. And they'll be like, oh, yeah, okay, I understand that. Or like I said earlier, maybe you don't even show people, maybe it just affects how you communicate with them. And then it can be I think distinguishing between responsible and accountable can be kind of tricky until you get used to it. So it's
That's
really
yeah.
it's really keeping in mind, like, responsible is whoever's doing the thing. Accountable is I need to make sure it gets done. So just kind of living with that and practicing it a little while and keeping those definitions nearby until you get used to those terms. But
Yeah.
for example, in my company, talking about approvers is a really big thing that we have to kind of clarify one project at a time. So in that sense, using the term like approvers, those are people accountable for different pieces. So that's a way that we kind of talk about that and work that out.
That's great. That's great. So on the same note, it's we have a myth. Okay, for small projects, we can avoid a lot of documentation because we don't need, you
Mhm.
know. So do you think a Rasimetrics is useful for any small scale projects?
I would say two things. I think it matters more, um, if the people on the if your stakeholders or your team members are new to working with each other, or if they're very familiar with working with each other. I think that matters more than the size of the project. For example, I can think of a cross organizational project that I worked on where there were probably 7 team members, but we had way more conversations about roles at the beginning and over as we went, just because we hadn't worked together before. So I would think about the newness of the team and the stakeholders as more important of whether you really need to think through this and write this out. But then my other answer to your question is, you don't always need to write it out. The important thing is to think about it and let those roles influence how you communicate with your teams, whether you ever write it out or not.
That's great answer. So again, there is a need, that you must go for Rasimetrics according to the uniqueness and the requirement of the project. However, you can skip it if you are well familiar with your team. But it's always recommended that you can go ahead and create a Rasimetrics, which will help your team to understand their R&R in a better way. And
Mm-hmm.
later on, in case of any risks or surprises,
Mm-hmm.
it will help you to avoid those, you know
Right. Or deal with new
so
kinds of situations that the team hasn't faced
exactly.
before. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. So now let's move to something. else called agile project management. So, however,
Mhm.
to understand that note, if you are a project manager who is assigned to work on agile nature of projects, so what are the first steps be taken when you are leading the agile project with no prior experience?
Sure. So here's what I would say, and this is sort of coming from me taking a lot of my company's projects are waterfall, and another good chunk are agile, and so or another good chunk I should say are hybrid, and so we only have a few agile, and so this is kind of these ideas come from me taking my own kind of first steps in this area. But I would say a couple of things. I would say identify some mentors. That could be informal, free mentors within your company, outside your company. That could be working with your company to hire consultants to help you. In a paid setting, the mentorship could happen in any of those ways. But know who you're going to go and talk to about these issues. I'll also throw out the name Mike Griffiths. I ran into him at PMI's global summit in Atlanta last year, and he was I can tell he's a very seasoned agile teacher, very patient, very kind. He's a name to kind of look up if you're getting used to agile, implementing it. Um, so know who your mentors are and who's going to help you. Then I would say take some time to familiarize yourself on your own with the basic concepts in agile. If you've never done it before, it's like a whole new language with these new concepts, and they're a little different in different agile settings, but I think that's one of the big missing pieces. If you've never done it, like what is a sprint, what is a backlog, what is a project owner, what is a spike, what is a retrospective. Understanding what those you'll still tailor them to your individual situation, but learn about the basics of those concepts, and then you'll be in a position to not only choose which one's the right fit for your project, but you might very well be the person who has to teach those concepts to your teams. I think that's one of the things I learned early on from some attempts to implement agile that didn't get a lot of traction, and after reflecting, I realized that um, I hadn't focused enough on teaching my teams what these concepts were and why they mattered. And so I think it's really important to go in expecting to be the educator, even as you're the project manager, if your team is also new to these concepts. So what have I said so far? Learn concepts, identify your mentors, um, and then I would say the there's something that PMI has put out called the Disciplined Agile Browser, and it's a really cool concept and a really cool tool that it's intended for people that are pretty new to Agile, and it's kind of this you say like a hierarchy or a tree of all these like decision points that you might face in the course of an agile project, and like little lists of tools of like how people respond to those situations and what they implement. And so it's like if you haven't learned all of these tools or all of these approaches from experience, PMI has this tool that has like kind of outlined for you, so you at least have an idea of what your options are. And so I think this tool can really give you a leg up. So those three things. And then the last thing I would say is like, you still have something to offer because you know your team and your projects. So don't think that your knowledge of the context isn't relevant anymore because you haven't done agile. Like, you still need to tailor and say, based on what I know about my team and my setting, these approaches are likely to work, these aren't. So don't totally discount yourself and your instincts and what you already know. They still matter even if you haven't done agile before.
Correct. Yeah. So, and also in the agile world, we say it's all about mindset. It's all about the best practices. You know.
Mm-hmm.
So now you, as a new project manager who has no prior experience working on this, so for the first important thing for you is learning the technical or the theoretical concepts or building up that mindset. So at a time you have to work on the both the things. So
Mm-hmm.
how do you see this one? Learning the mindset or developing the agile mindset.
Hmm. I think that. when I was using some study materials for my PMP, some of them were really helpful in like they had experienced agile practitioners talking about like explaining these concepts, but also like how they really use them with their teams, and what benefits that provides for their teams. And it's like you know how you can understand a concept, but you can also like how what it's like when you catch a vision for something and like where it's going and why it works, and then you kind of have these instincts and we're like, oh, it's that. um I think it helps to also like listen to people that do agile, whether it's whether it's just talking to mentors, whether it's resources of people out there telling real stories, like this is how it really went, doing our daily stand-ups or our retrospectives. It goes beyond knowing the concepts and kind of you can like catch it from other people like you'd catch a vision. And I think you know um, you can still go to agilemanifesto.com or .org or whatever it is and look at these original kind of founding principles, and that's really cool, and you can read that. But I I think hearing real people's real stories of using it can go a long way to getting it to click for you and letting you be able to hit the ground running faster, even if you've never done it.
Awesome. That's a great one. So to summarize our discussion, we have discussed about the collaboration, the importance of communication, team building, and some of the tools and techniques. Now, what are, if I ask you to encourage the all the entry level projects managers out there with three strong tips? So, what are the different three tips you would like to give them?
Hmm. I'll just be honest. I don't know if I can build much on what I've already said. I think that or maybe I can add this. So mostly I'll say if you tried and it has flopped, keep going. Don't think because it didn't work once that it's like anything with any part of project management. It's a journey, not only for you but for your teams. And that is like is in a lot of ways agile. Like the process of implementing agile is agile. It is iterative. It is the process of deciding what works. Like that's built into what agile is. So if you just start, you'll be in a position to build on it, to add more knowledge. And so I mean, yeah, don't be afraid to get started. Don't be afraid to fail. Don't be afraid to keep learning. That's probably what I can
Yeah.
say.
Those are spot on. So the important thing is just start today. Once you start, just keep on learning and
Mhm.
don't afraid of being of the failure, because
Mhm.
it's one of the stepping stone. So no need to worry, and you start going on. Things will fall on your way. So that's great. I think with that we wrap up our discussion on the latest trends and the technical stuff of project management. I hope our listeners found the insights valuable. Now let's switch the gear a bit, and I personally believe understanding our speaker, the guest, in a deeper way is much important. So I have few fun and interesting questions for you. So are you good for
Great.
that?
I'm ready. What do you got for me?
Okay. So let's start with something light and very joyful. Like, what's your hobby and interest? Recently you have picked up, which brings you joy outside of your work.
Sure. I'm I'm really grateful to live in a neighborhood where my neighbors and I are out walking a lot, and we have a lot of neighborhood events, and it's close knit. So a lot of my time having fun is just kind of spent out with neighbors, neighborhood events. So so that's one thing. I also really enjoy travel. Um, I've always I've always been drawn to it. I was lucky enough to do something called Semester at Sea in college, where I visited 14 different countries in the course of a semester. And I'm really grateful for kind of having that realistic perspective on the world. And I love how, getting to know people who are different from me, like, really helps me understand myself, helps me gain new perspectives. Like, fresh perspectives are the thing that have, like, helped me grow the most in my life and continue to kind of, like, create mental health boosts. So yeah, those are some things where that my non-working time goes to.
That sounds amazing, you know. So, speaking of joy, if you could travel to anywhere in the world, so
Mhm.
where it would be and why?
Hmm. Um, Man, I mean, largely I love the variety, but I think I have a special spot in my heart for Japan. I've been twice. I would love to go back and spend more time. I it's been I think the country and the architecture is beautiful. I love the food. I've experienced the people to be very kind. There's kind of a peaceful quiet there that I'm sure it's very different as a visitor than it is someone growing up there. But to me, I experience it that way. And I've always been, yeah, drawn to Japanese history and culture in a way that I can't quite put into words. So,
So that's great. So always, traveling uh, always has a way to broadening our perspectives.
mhm,
It showcases the real you or the real world. So
mhm.
that's great. Now shifting our gears a bit. So you have any favorite book or quotation which inspired you a lot?
Hmm. Um, sure. Not to be lame and bring it back to project management, but I'm going to. One my There's a book about project management that really inspires me. It's called um, "How Big Things Get Done," and I can get a link to Sunil in the show notes to that. But it's a couple of years old, and it's very well researched, and it's it highlights some of the big in a very data driven but also well illustrated storytelling kind of way, um, what some of the unexpected factors are that make some of the world's most massive projects successful. And kind of one of the statistics they highlight early in the book that stuck with me is that of, like, mega projects, massive projects around the world, think like major road reconstructions, think like putting on the Olympics, mega projects like that. What percent of those projects do you think, like, are done on time, on budget, and like achieve everything they set out to achieve? And the number they put on that based on their data was 0.5%. 0.5% of those massive projects achieve all of those things. And so these two gentlemen sent out to kind of do research on, like, what are those 0.5% doing right? And it really kind of made me feel inspired to learn for myself and then to help other people grow in, like, those principles that really make our projects achieve their goals, because achieving these goals is really, like, what we're here to do. And especially when they're big important goals in the world, like, let's let's actually make them happen as we're setting out to do. So it's called How Big Things Get Done. It's the name of the book.
So that this sounds incredible. So definitely we will link this in our description. So please go and watch out. Now shifting our gears again a bit. So what's the best piece of advice you have received ever, and how has it influenced you in your life?
Hmm. Gosh,
Anything?
it's hard to pick one for my whole life, but I can think of one that was particularly impactful when I was about 17 years old. I was in high school, and uh, I I don't think it's uncommon for project managers to have perfectionist tendencies. I think not all of us, but some of us are definitely in that camp. And growing up, I was very much in that camp. And I had I had a really influential person in my life talk about, he was maybe 10 or 15 years older than me, and talk about how, like, he had kind of managed his time in college and he had a fiance, and how, like, he would decide at a certain point that, like, he was going to stop doing his homework and go get ice cream with his fiance. And he used this term, responsible neglect. And it just spoke to me as a perfectionist, the idea that sometimes it is responsible to neglect the thing you think you're supposed to do, or the thing you're expected to do, in order to spend time on the thing that's actually important. Um, so it can be hard to just make the decision to do that if you're stuck in kind of a perfectionist place. But I really appreciated the idea that it is responsible to neglect things sometimes, and why that matters. And I really point to that moment and that concept and that conversation that kind of broke me of most of my perfectionism that I had had in my life. So I hope that helps somebody on listening to this.
That's great. It's so insightful. Moving on, what's your favorite way to stay productive and motivated? You have
Hmm.
any tricks for you?
Hmm. I think the thing that's made the most difference for me in the last few years has been getting better at taking breaks. Um, that's a thing that's been really difficult for me a lot of my life. Maybe not surprising,
That's
given I
important.
just talked about perfectionism. Um, but it's a thing I've been bad at, but also I've struggled on and off with burnout. And so I've gotten to the point that I'm like, I have to stop, and really trying to face that. And I won't say that if you're bad at taking breaks that it's easy to get started. It's not easy to get started. Um, but I have started out of necessity, and I've watched myself have an easier time staying motivated and being more productive during the times that I'm committed to working, when there are more times that I'm committed to not working. Um, so obviously it's a balance, right? And finding that the formula or the cadence of breaks and working time that works for you. But I definitely needed more, and I think, to somebody who hasn't gotten started yet, I just really encourage you to give it a chance, and you might be surprised at how much more productive you are while you're working if you spend a little more time, a little more often, not working.
That's great. So this is so insightful, and thank you so much for sharing this wonderful insights. Okay, so it's always great to know our guests on a deeper level, and to our audience, I hope you enjoyed this segment as much I did. So with this, I would like to wrap up the show. And so before that, so Megan, what are the final thoughts you would like to share with our audience about the podcast, or what's your thoughts?
Hmm. Um, I'm I'm really excited to see what Sunil's future guests have to say. I can tell that he's dedicated to tracking down insightful guests, not because he invited me, but because some of the other people that I've seen that have been on his show. So so I'm really looking forward to hearing what's coming next, and I hope your audience really can stay connected and subscribe and track along with that as well. So thank you for what you're doing, and for kind of what you're building here, and all these insights that you're gathering together in one place.
Mhm. Thank you so much for your time as well, because you know really I enjoyed a thorough communication, the conversation today, and it was a lot of insightful discussion. So thanks for the time, and thanks everyone for watching this show. Next week, again, we will meet with a new episode with a new guest. Till then, stay tuned, subscribe us on YouTube, and talk to you soon again. Thanks, Megan. Thanks for your time. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, Sunil. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks you.